Boa tarde. Good afternoon. We are live. Everybody welcome. We are on the Jewish Genealogical Society São Paulo YouTube channel. And I'll invite here to the screen also our Vice President, Katia. Welcome.
Hello. Yes, hello.
Please greet our
Boa
Portuguese
tarde,
audience.
gente. Eu vou fazer as boas-vindas em português, tá? Então, bem-vindos à Sociedade de Genealogia Judaica de São Paulo, Sociedade Genealógica Judaica de São Paulo. A gente vai falar um pouquinho antes da apresentação. O Roberto vai estar falando em inglês, eu vou estar falando em português. Vamos lá, Roberto. Quem somos nós?
Okay, we are just a group of dedicated volunteers working out from São Paulo. We are affiliated to the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies.
Ok. Bom, nós somos um grupo de voluntários, todos nós voluntários, dedicados, trabalhando a partir de São Paulo, né, e filiados à Sociedade Internacional de Genealogia Judaica.
Okay, as a volunteer activity, all costs are supported by ourselves and by additional contributions. If you think you would like to contribute, we have a PayPal account. Its email address on screen.
Como voluntários, todas as nossas atividades são financiadas por nós, né, por os voluntários, e por quem queira contribuir com o que a gente faz, veja uma identificação, veja um valor no que a gente está fazendo, né, através de doações via PayPal. A conta está aí, colocada na tela.
Okay, in order to interest people into researching about their Jewish ancestry, we deliver periodical speeches as the ones we have today in order to encourage people to do their own research.
Como dentro do nosso objetivo de incentivar e auxiliar os participantes a pesquisar sobre seus ancestrais de origem judaica, a gente encoraja as pessoas a participar nessa pesquisa, né? E nós disponibilizamos conhecimento, como palestras como as de hoje, sobre pessoas que fizeram essa jornada, né? Para que a gente possa se incentivar, se motivar e se inspirar nessas pessoas.
On other opportunities, we disseminate knowledge about available databases on various online resources, and we hope this way we encourage everybody who's watching us to preserve family histories for the next generations.
Outra atividade que a gente faz, em outra situação, né, é disseminar conhecimento sobre quais são as bases de dados que existem hoje para que possam ser pesquisadas. Isso aí, todas as atividades, a gente entende que vão incentivar-nos a preservar as histórias de família como um legado para as próximas gerações, né? A gente costuma pensar em pesquisar genealogia como eu quero descobrir o que houve para trás. E a gente esquece que a gente vai ser um ancestral de alguém, né? Então, tudo que a gente pesquisa e descobre, a gente deixa para os nossos ancestrais. Então, é um ato de amor, não só para quem veio antes, como para quem vem depois.
Okay, in case if you want to receive our news, please go on our website through this link here, and you will view this form here to provide your email address to us.
Então, se você quiser receber mais informações, a gente te pede para entrar nesse link e preencher um pequeno formulário muito simples para recebimento de e-mails. Não tem spam, a gente não vende isso para ninguém, é só nosso mesmo, para comunicação com vocês. Esse é o objetivo. E-mail, primeiro nome, último nome e o telefone.
Okay, our communication also goes over Facebook. We do 2 posts per week. So if you would like to follow us also on our fan page, we thank you.
E também outra forma de comunicação é a nossa página do Facebook, está aí colocada, que 2 vezes por semana a gente posta alguma coisa, e a gente também pede que vocês se mantenham informados através de lá. É outra forma de comunicação nossa.
As you already know, we also have a YouTube channel through which you are watching us at this moment. And we also already have scheduled a next transmission, which will cover the DNA testing subject. We will be telling you more about our next event at the end of this show.
E como vocês já sabem, até porque vocês estão nele, a gente também tem um canal de YouTube, né? Onde a gente essa apresentação e outras são guardadas. E a gente já tem a programação da nossa próxima apresentação, que vai ser sobre o tema de genealogia genética, e que vocês vão ver ao final dessa apresentação. A gente vai dar mais detalhes de qual vai ser a nossa próxima atração, nossa próxima estrela.
Okay, so we incentivate you to mark that you are liking this show and that you follow our YouTube channel also. Thank you.
Então, a gente pede aquele clássico, dá um joinha, pede para seguir, marca a gente para que você possa receber informações. Nos ajuda e ajuda você.
Okay, so that's our short introduction. I will now invite our colleague Luisa to the screen. She will be presenting our today's speaker. Please, Luisa, welcome.
Thank you so much.
In charge of presenting Mr. Rolf Salinger. Thank you.
Obrigada, gente. Então, eu vou apresentar o nosso convidado de hoje. O nome dele é Rolf Salinger. Ele nasceu na Inglaterra em 1946. Aos 10 anos de idade, ele migrou para Nova Zelândia com a sua mãe, onde estudou para ser professor primário. Em 1973, foi a Israel como voluntário e mais tarde migrou para Israel em 1975. Desde então, Rolf vive em um pequeno kibutz chamado Kfar Ruppin e realizou uma grande variedade de trabalhos, e ele se autodescreve como um pau para toda obra e um mestre do nada. Bom, Rolf, então por que o Rolf está aqui com a gente hoje? Ele levou 20 anos pesquisando a história da família dele. Desde 2002, ele está envolvido com várias atividades relativas às comunidades judaicas da Lituânia. Ele serviu no conselho do Litvak-Sig, que é um site de consultas para a genealogia judaica da Lituânia. Então, ele serviu no conselho de 2011 a 2019. Foi diretor de associados e de perenidade de fundos do mesmo site, Litvak-Sig. Ele é coordenador de pesquisa dos distritos de Disna, Panevėžys e Kaunas no Litvak-Sig. Ele renovou e realizou os registros dos cemitérios judaicos das cidades de Vilkaviškis, Kalvarija, Balbareskis e trabalhou no cemitério judaico de Vistitis. Publicou já um livro sobre a Vilkaviškis judaica em inglês e lituano. Criou um website dedicado à memória judaica dessa cidade, Vilkaviškis, chamado Jewish Vilkaviškis. O site é www.jewishvilkaviškis.org. E ele é comprometido com a preservação da memória e da herança judaica em Vilkaviškis através de palestras, artigos em jornais, programas de TV e várias atividades de voluntariado, o que levou ele a ser considerado como cidadão honorário dessa cidade. O Rolf está semi-aposentado, mas dirige o programa de reciclagem de Kfar Ruppin, cuida do cemitério do kibutz e é o cortador de grama oficial do kibutz. E, segundo ele, faz a melhor compostagem de Israel. É casado com Beth, tem 3 filhos, 2 moram no kibutz e são afortunados em ter 4 netos que também moram no kibutz. Particularmente, eu sou fã do Rolf, porque ele foi uma das primeiras pessoas a me ajudar na minha pesquisa genealógica, quando eu comecei a pesquisar a família da minha mãe, a família dos Plaček, e meu bisavô nasceu nessa cidade que o Rolf é cidadão honorário, chama Vilkaviškis. Então, pessoal, agora eu vou fazer em inglês, para quem não me entendeu em português. Hello, everyone. My name is Luisa, and I am introducing Ralph, who was born in United Kingdom in 1946. At the age of 10, he immigrated with his mother to New Zealand, where he trained to be a primary school teacher. In 1973, he went to Israel as a volunteer and later immigrated to Israel in 1975. Ralph has lived in a small kibbutz called Kfar Ruppin and carried out a wide variety of jobs. He describes himself as a jack of all trades and a master of none. Ralph Salinger spent 20 years researching his family history. Since 2002, he has been involved in various activities regarding the Jewish communities and in Lithuania. He served on the board of Litvaksig from 2011 to 2019. Litvaksig, for those who don't know, it's a website where you can search your genealogical family history of Lithuania, Jewish Lithuania. He was a member and chairman and chair of Continuity Fund at Litvaksig, the same website. Still is the district coordinator for the districts of Desna, Panevėžys, and Kaunas at Litvaksig. He renewed and recorded the Jewish cemeteries of Vilkaviškis, Kalvarija, Balberiskis, and work on the Jewish cemetery of Vistitis, all cities in Lithuania. He published a book called Jewish Vilkaviškis, also in English and Lithuanian. He created a website dedicated to the Jewish memory and history of the city of Vilkaviškis, and the website is called Jewish Vilkaviškis, www.jewishvilkaviškis.org. He's committed to preserving the Jewish memory and heritage in Vilkaviškis through lectures, newspaper articles, TV shows, and volunteering, which led him to become honorary citizen of this town. Nowadays, Ralph is semi-retired, but runs the village recycling program, looks after the village cemetery, is the village grass cutter, and as he says, he makes the best compost of Israel. He is married to his present wife, Betty. They have 3 children, 2 of whom live in the village, and they are fortunate to have 4 grandchildren who also live in the village. Particularly, I am a very big fan of Ralph's. When I started searching my family, my mother's family from Lithuania, he was one of the first persons I contacted, and we still have contact till today. And he helped me a little bit. And when I got my Lithuanian citizenship, I shared with him. So, with you, com vocês, Ralph Salinger.
Good afternoon, or good evening, Lithuania, Brazil. You'll excuse me because it's the first time that I've ever spoken to a group of people in Brazil, and I hope very much that it'll be of interest to you. Roberto, can we have the first slide, please? Okay. I think it speaks for itself. So can we go to the next slide, please? I suppose my story really begins in June 1982, when I found myself as an Israeli soldier in an Israeli armored column fighting in the First Lebanese War. Roberto, the next slide, please. A couple of weeks prior to this, my first daughter, Rama Bronwyn Salinger, was born. So you can imagine all the feelings that were going on in my mind. Roberto, can we have the next slide, please? And you can see from this, she grew to be a real sweetie, and she still is. Roberto, next slide, please. I think the experience of, and now I'm going back to the war in Lebanon, the experience of seeing the roads crowded with refugees suddenly brought back to me the memories of the Holocaust. Next slide, please, Roberto. My parents, Ernest and Bianca Salinger, had fled Germany in 1939 and fled to England. This is a picture of my parents in England around 1941. And as you can see, there was a rather large age difference. My father was 60 and my mother was only 26. Next slide, Roberto, please. Now, my father brought one of his sons by a previous marriage with him. And after my father died, when I was around 2, Gerhard, my stepbrother, became like a father to me. Oh dear. Now, England in the 1950s was not the multicultural society that it is today. And I'd often come home from school beaten because because they called me a dirty Jew. And again, I felt alone. Next slide, please, Roberto. My first meeting with the Holocaust was in 1953. My mother had hired a television set so she could see the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. A few days later, I saw a program about World War II, and these were the pictures. I was only 7. My mother became hysterical, and again, I was left alone. Next slide, please. Now, things began to improve somewhat when at the age of 10, we immigrated to New Zealand. And there I felt a sense of freedom because certainly there was none of the anti-Semitism that I'd experienced in Great Britain. Next slide, please, Roberto. Thank you. Okay. This is my first wife, Lesleigh. And I must say, I consider myself one of the few nice Jewish boys ever having been married in an Anglican cathedral. Can we have the next slide, please? I think, as I said in the introduction, that I'd studied to be a school teacher. I taught in New Zealand, and as you can see from the next slide, Roberto, we left New Zealand, and I carried on teaching in the United Kingdom. Now, believe it or not, during the first days of the Yom Kippur War, I had a vision. Yes, I had a vision. I'm not a religious person, but the skies opened up, and somebody or something told me that I had to go to Israel as a volunteer. So we packed up and we went off to Israel. And as Louisa said in the introduction, and Lisa, I forgot to thank you for your wonderfully detailed introduction of who I am. As Louisa said, during my working years on the kibbutz, I consider myself a jack of all trades and master of none. And then I had the wonderful treat of getting, next slide, please, Roberto. I had the wonderful treat in 1980 of marrying the most wonderful woman in the world, an Israeli from Tel Aviv called Betty. Okay, and there we are. And now, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we go back to 1982, because I returned from the war and discovered that I was a father, and yet I really knew nothing of my father. And so began a journey of 20 years to try and discover my family's history, and particularly, who was my father. Thank you, Roberto. I have to add here that my mother, as a refugee from Germany, never spoke a word about her family, about my father's family. Silence was the rule of the day, and so really I had to begin from scratch. you can see there in the picture that Roberta so kindly put up, my father, as I said before, he was born in 1882, so this is a picture of him at the age of 8. And ladies and gentlemen, you have to remember that this research was done in the 1980s, when really the only thing you could do with a computer was to play ping pong. Roberto, the next slide, please. I found a picture. It's a wonderful picture. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandfather was Louis Salinger, and he was born in Suwałki in the Russian Empire in 1848. And my grandmother, Ida, who was born in East Prussia in 1885. And there's a lovely story how they met, but Roberto said, Ralph, you've only got 45 minutes, so we'll leave it for today. My father is a young man. Okay, so this for me is picture 22, and it's a picture of my father, who, of course, served as a soldier in the German army in the First World War, and he's staying there with my half sister Ruth, which is another long story which we won't go into today. Then my father married his secretary, and they had 2 more children. 1938 comes along, Crystal Night, and my father's imprisoned. Next slide, please, Roberto. My father's imprisoned in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and by now he's 56. With the help of his wonderful. With the help of his brother and sister, he's released in 1939, and with Gerhard, my half-brother, they come to England. Next slide, please. And he meets my mother, but they begin a relationship, but then he's interned again in an internment camp on the Isle of Man. Next slide, please. So once I finished discovering my very, very immediate family, I was lucky enough to find a genealogist in the United States who we made a deal, and he was able to trace my family through the Mormon records, because at this time these were really the only records that were available. So he's able to make a jump another 3 generations back. That's one of the old Polish records about my family in the 19th century. Okay, so now we arrive in the year 2002, and after 20 years of searching, I decided, okay, what I'd found, and what I wasn't going to find, I wasn't going to find either. And so it was time to close this episode. And I thought that the best way to close it would be to make a roots tour around Eastern Europe, visiting all the villages where the Salingers had lived. This is a picture of a flour mill that used to be in East Prussia, where my grandfather worked after he left Suwałki. I have to add here that I didn't want to go alone, and I was able to bribe my eldest daughter, the baby that you saw at the beginning of the talk, and she came along with me. Next slide, please, Roberto. This was the small town in East Prussia where my grandmother was born. Next slide, please, Roberto. And this was a picture that, again, somebody sent me showing my grandmother and her family. Next slide, please, Roberto. Once again, I'm on a roots tour with my eldest daughter in the town of Suwałki, which today is in Poland. And it was incredible walking about the streets where my family had lived. I can really recommend it. Next slide, please. And there's Rama. At the beginning, you saw her as a baby, but she's grown. She finished her army service and she came along with me. This is the remains of the Jewish cemetery in Suwałki. Next slide, please, Roberto. Thank you. And here, we didn't make a lot of discoveries, but we even found a Salinger grave in the Jewish cemetery in Suwałki. Not really quite sure who it belongs to. Next slide, please. And then we arrived in the village of Krojanki, where I discovered my earliest ancestor, Zelig Solomon, first appeared around 1732. Next slide, please. And there we are. That's Rama in the middle with the camera, Wojciech with a white shirt and an old man. And here we were standing in the old Jewish cemetery in Krojanki. Next slide, please, Roberto. This is from a Prussian document. Next slide, please, Roberto. Yeah, this is a Prussian document from 1772, which shows my earliest ancestor. Thank you. Next slide, please. On this map, you can see, or I hope you can see, the journey that my family took. The beginning in Krojanki, moving to Lomża, then to Suwałki, and one branch went north to this little town in Lithuania called Vilkaviškis. My grandfather left Suwałki, came to Wormditz, and then finally he settled in Berlin. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? And this is Vilkaviškis. It's a small town in Lithuania where today live, we'll say, 14,000 people. Next slide, please. Now, from all the records that I've discovered, I know that my family, or one branch of my family, lived here from 1805 till at least until the last of the Salingers were killed here in 1941. I think one of the things that was most special for me was the fact that in all the places that we visited, and we visited a lot, we always found something connected with the Jews. Not particularly for my family, but something Jewish. And in Vilkaviškis, I found nothing. Okay, next slide, please, Roberto. There's a picture of one branch of my family that lived in Vilkaviškis and left for the United States in the 1920s. Next slide, please. And another group of Salingers. You can see we're quite productive sorts of people that unfortunately didn't survive and were killed in Vilkaviškis in 1941. Next slide, please. Okay. So on the in the top right-hand corner, you've got my family in Berlin, living a very pleasant life in the 1930s, and another two pictures of life in Vilkaviškis, about the same time. Next slide, please. Okay, so once I got back to Israel, this matter of there being no evidence of Jewish life in Vilkaviškis began to eat at me. And so I decided that I was going to go back to Vilkaviškis and start hunting. And in 2007, I went back with a friend, and our plan was to record the Jewish cemetery. Of course, that's easier said than done when you've got a cemetery that hasn't been touched since 1941. But with the help of the municipality, they got it cleaned up and then we were able to record it. Next slide, please. Hello. I'm not sure what. Oh, yes. And would you believe it? I discovered a Salinger grave in the Jewish in the cemetery once we'd cleaned it. Now, look, I'm not a fanatic about cleaning cemeteries, and the system that I use involves, would you believe it or not, shaving cream. Something we can talk about later on. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of me working with school kids in Calvaria, which is the neighboring town. Next slide, please. I think part of my presence there, and I try to get back there every year, is to, how can I say it, to allow the local people to understand the Jewish history of their town. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. In this case, it worked, where one of the teachers every year makes sure that the cemetery is kept clean. Yeah. Next slide, please. And of course, if somebody asks me to talk, I'm always willing to talk about what I do, because it makes, because I think it's important. Here I am on television in Mariupol, and just behind me is, believe it or not, a Jewish synagogue. Next slide, please. And of course, sometimes I even speak on television in Israel. Next slide, please. And here I am speaking in one of the schools in Vilkaviškis. Lithuanian children are incredibly well disciplined. I don't know how they are in Brazil, but you can stand there and talk for half an hour and nobody moves, nobody says anything. And when you say, are there any questions? None of those either. Okay, Roberto, next slide, please. And we held I asked the children to draw their impression of the Holocaust, and some of their pictures were very, very moving. Next slide, please, Roberto. That's a picture, one of the pages of the, how do you say, the records of the Jewish community from Vilkaviškis. But next slide, please. One of the things that I discovered was that in the interwar period, Jews also had to join the Lithuanian army, and one of the rules there was that the Jewish soldiers had to swear allegiance to their religious leader, and these are the Jewish soldiers of Vilkaviškis at the swearing in ceremony in their pledge of allegiance to the Lithuanian state, standing in front of the great synagogue in Vilkaviškis.
Interessante. Sorry, Ralph, just a minute. I would like to translate this. It's very interesting.
Sorry.
O que ele descobriu é que nesse período, entre as duas guerras, né, os soldados judeus eram obrigados a fazer o juramento de fidelidade, né, e esse juramento era feito com a autoridade rabínica local. Esses são alguns soldados judeus fazendo esse juramento. Obrigada. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Okay. One of the other projects we did was to place plaques in English and Lithuanian on the buildings that all had been Jewish and still remained after the war. This was a plaque that we placed at the site of the great synagogue in Vilkaviškis. Next slide, please. Another part of my project, and after I'd begun my project there, it sort of grew like Topsy. And so I built this internet site and discovered more people who had their roots in the Jewish roots in Vilkaviscus. And somebody told me about this is the daughter and the granddaughter of a righteous Gentile from Vilkaviscus. And the daughter was quite sick, so we raised funds and brought them to Israel for medical treatment. And you can see them standing there by the tree in Yad Vashem. Next, please. Slide, please. And the little old lady with the blue hat is one of the actual righteous Gentiles from Vilkaviscus. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the other things I do that when I'm there, and there are still old people that want to talk about the Jewish, that still remember the Jewish community, so I go along and record them and photograph them. Next slide, please. The gentleman with the white hair was the head of the local museum, and the guy with the camera was a newspaper reporter, both from Vilkaviscus. Basically me and some crazy ideas, I managed to bring them to Israel because I thought it was important that they meet the second generation and they understand more about who we are and what we do. Next slide, please. And Louisa, in a wonderful introduction, said that I published a book, first in Lithuanian and then afterwards in English, about the Jews of Vilkaviscus. Next slide, please. There's some famous people that came from Vilkaviscus. If you ever like watching Star Trek, and you recognize this is an elderly William Shatner, his grandparents came from Vilkaviscus. Next slide, please. And this is in Vilkaviscus. And the Israeli artist, world-famous Israeli artist, Aaron Appel, was also from Vilkaviscus. Next slide, please. And the founder of the Dutch Ballet was also from Vilkaviscus. Next slide, please. Oh, this was a project that I did, I think, 3 years ago. I made a sign at the site of the Holocaust in Vilkaviscus, explaining the Holocaust there in English, Lithuanian, and Hebrew. And next to it, that's the picture at the bottom, we planted 58 trees, one for each righteous Gentile from Vilkaviscus. Yes, next please. There's a wonderful school teacher called Vaida, and every year she produces a most moving Holocaust memorial service. Really, I take my hat off to her. Next slide, please. Okay. Yes, next slide. It's part of the Holocaust. And the municipality produced a brochure showing Jewish sites. Next slide, please. I see myself as a clearinghouse for information on Jewish Vilkaviscus. And one of the things that helped me a lot is the help of the local newspaper. And whenever I have anything interesting, for instance, I don't know how well you can see it, I managed to discover class pictures from the high school gymnasium there. And they thought it was interesting too, and so they wrote an article. Next slide, please. I was incredibly fortunate to discover a lady, just by chance, who was bitten by a Lithuanian lady called Ilma, who was bitten by the Jewish bug And she went off and she did a guides tour, and she has delved into the Jewish history of Vilkaviškis, and now she's a registered guide. And so the people there, not all the people speak English, so now they have a local telling them the history of their town. It was wonderful, simply wonderful. Next slide, please. You wouldn't believe it. Somebody rang up and said, "Look, would you be prepared to speak to in a home for mentally retarded adults about Jewish Vilkaviškis?" And I thought this would be absolutely impossible, but as you can see, Ilma did it incredibly well. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my last project. This is a picture of the Jewish volunteer firemen of Vilkaviškis. Now, the Jews and the Christians lived separate lives. And they lived in separate parts of the town, but one of the places that they came together was for the volunteer fire brigade, which had been set up already in 1889. Of course, most of the houses were made of wood, so this was a really essential organization. And I thought, my goodness me, I can't have these wonderful pictures of these wonderful people just sitting in an archive. Next slide, please. So Ilma found the old fire station in Vilkaviškis. So what we decided to do was to prepare 15 pictures of Jewish life in Vilkaviškis, which included 5 or 6 pictures of Jewish firemen. Now, what you see in front of you is just a mock-up. We produced these 15 pictures. Each picture is 2 meters on 1 meter. And last week, after they painted the walls and cleaned everything up, there in the middle of the city, in the middle of the town, is this outdoor photo exhibition of Jewish life. That was really, really something. Okay. Now, the story of one's genealogy really never ends. There's a picture there of my mother when she was younger. Yeah, it was 1938 in Berlin. And our relations were never good. Never good. Okay, next picture, please. When she died, she left me a picture of her parents. And it said that they died in a concentration camp in 1942. That was it. And a couple of months ago, I decided that it was time to put aside all my problems with my mother and to give them some sort of memorial. And I thought the best thing to do was to make for them some stepping stones. So I wrote to the organization in Berlin with all the information that I had. And they said, well, would you mind if we investigate, find out some more about them? Next slide, please. And they discovered that they weren't sent to a concentration camp. That in fact, they were deported to Lithuania, to Kaunas, in 1941. Next slide, please. And you can see here the route that the deportation train took. And the next slide. And they were brutally murdered with another 1,042 Jews at the 9th Fort in Kaunas at the end of November in 1941. And the last slide, I think. Sorry, this is the second to last slide. These are the stepping stones that I had made for my grandparents. And next slide, which I think is the last slide. Now, I hope you can see this as large as possible, because despite all the pain and all the agony and all the suffering and problems that I had in my life, I must say that I really am the luckiest man in the world. I got a great wife, I got 3 wonderful children, and I got 4 incredibly funny grandchildren. I call our family almost the United Nations, because my eldest daughter married a guy from Russia, and my son married a wonderful woman from Ethiopia. So we're all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors and whatnot. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I hope there was something interesting here for you. And thank you for all the people of your wonderful organization who've done an incredible job. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. As I said before, I am a very big fan of you, because I know you began from nothing and you digged and digged and digged in a time that there was no internet, and you had to write letters or you had to travel somewhere to find out something. So my first question is, where did you find all the strength, or how did you kept going without failing to search and search in a time so difficult? And how many places did you go, and how many people did you contacted to really find so many things and so much about your family? What kept you going?
Louisa, I'm going to tell you a secret, okay? That nobody else knows.
Okay.
Do you want it translated? You want it to translate as we go or at the end?
Kátia?
Well, bom, a Luísa perguntou onde o Ralph encontrava forças, né, para seguir. Ralph, can you repeat your answer?
I'm going to tell you a secret that nobody else knows.
Ok, eu vou te contar um segredo que ninguém mais sabe, ninguém mais adivinha.
I'm living on a kibutz, and then it was socialism, which I understand in Brazil you don't like.
No, we have not experienced.
Ele estava vivendo num kibutz, num sistema socialista, que ele entende que no Brasil as pessoas, ou algumas pessoas, não gostem. And? So,
in those days, under the great kibbutz socialism, everything was free.
E naqueles tempos, debaixo desse socialismo, tudo era gratuito.
Exactly. Livre. So I wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. And the paper was free.
Centenas e centenas de cartas.
And the paper was free, the envelopes were free, and the postage was free.
E aí o papel era gratuito, o envelope era gratuito, o selo era gratuito. Então, enviou.
And that's what I did before there was internet.
E esse é o jeito que ele fez antes da internet. Olha que maneira inovadora. Que para a gente parece quase muito remoto. Mas eu, pelo menos, vivi isso.
Okay, thank you. And so I have a second question. If you can tell us a little bit in a short way about your Greek connection with your stepsister. Not steps, yes. How do you say in English?
Você pode falar para a gente como é que é a sua conexão com a sua irmã?
Meia-irmã.
Meia-irmã, obrigada.
Da Grécia.
Se você quiser, da Grécia, que vive hoje na Grécia, né?
It was 1980, and I was sitting with my mother and my stepfather in New Zealand because they'd invited us to come there for our wedding, the wedding with Betty.
Então era.
Pode seguir, Luiz.
Ok. Então era em 1980, eu estava na Nova Zelândia com a minha mãe e o meu padrasto. Ok, go on.
With the cornflakes, my mother said to me, "You know you have a sister in Greece?"
E aí, numa conversa, a minha mãe simplesmente falou: "Você sabe que você tem uma irmã na Grécia?" Ok.
And at this stage, I wasn't interested in the family researches. But afterwards, I began researching, and I discovered that my father had a relationship with a non-Jewish woman, and my half-sister was born in Berlin in 1908, 1909.
Então, naquela época, eu não estava interessado em genealogia, mas mais tarde eu pesquisei e descobri que o meu pai teve um relacionamento em Berlim com uma pessoa não judia e e ele teve uma filha em 1908. Ok?
My father didn't marry her mother, but supported her.
O meu pai não casou com a mãe da menina, mas ele sustentava ambas.
She studied to become a lawyer, but in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she decided that having a Jewish father wasn't the healthiest thing to do, and so she went off to be a kindergarten teacher in Greece.
Então, a minha irmã estudou para ser advogada e em 1933, quando Hitler veio ao poder, ela se deu conta que estar na Alemanha com um passado judaico não era muito bom, então ela foi para a Grécia para ser uma professora de jardim de infância.
And in 1989, I got on a plane and I flew to Athens and I knocked on the door, and on the other side, the door opened and there was a little old lady and she was my sister.
Então, em 1999?
1989.
Então, em 1988, ele pegou um avião, foi para a Grécia, descobriu onde a irmã estava e bateu na porta da irmã e eles se conheceram. E ali estava uma pessoa baixinha, pequenininha, que era a irmã dele.
Unbelievable. And she told me about my father when he would come home on leave and bring her an orange.
E ela me contou sobre o meu pai, que quando ele vinha para casa na folga e levava laranjas para ela.
What a story. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Tem alguma pergunta do público? Is there any questions from the audience? Rolf, are you doing enough in the... I can't pronounce the name.
Vilkaviscus.
Yes.
Vilkaviscus? Augustus está perguntando. Augustus is asking, are we doing enough?
Who, we?
Yes. We. Me, myself,
Augustus
and I.
is asking you.
We.
Yeah.
Are we doing enough? Are we doing enough? How do you mean we?
No, but Augustus is asking you.
Yes.
And he's asking Augustus, what do you mean by we?
Yeah.
Am I doing... look, Augustus.
You and I, he's saying.
You and I. Yes, yeah, I think so. I think so. We finished the the outdoor photographic exhibition, and now and Corona's still around, and my project for 2023 is making a display called The Faces of Faith, talking about the Jews and the Catholics and the Lutherans, because up until 1941, the society had three sides, okay? Jews, Catholics, and Lutherans. And today, it's just Catholics. That's it. So, and Ruben says something, but it's in Portuguese, I think.
Yeah, if someone supported you on your trips to Lithuania.
Ruben, hello. It's a great question. The simple answer is no, and the more complex answer is when I do a project, I have a band of brothers, and I ask them $5, $10, $20, if I'm lucky, $50 for the projects. This is the way that I financed the book, the Signs for the Holocaust, the Trees for the Righteous Gentiles, and the photographs.
What do you call in Portuguese vaquinha, little cow?
Schnorr.
Fundraising between friends.
Between
Yes.
friends. You call it
Yeah.
little cow, vaquinha.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And something that for me is an example of life is that you began searching about your family, and suddenly you are searching for a whole city.
Mm-hmm.
Because Vilkaviškis became such a big project for you,
Mm-hmm.
that you no longer search for your family only. You search for all Jewish memory and history in Vilkaviškis. And for this, I take my hat to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we thank you. Any more questions, or should we thank your participation? How do you have anything else to add, or to comment, or to ask us?
Well, first of all, I apologize to Louisa for not saying thank you for the wonderful introduction.
No.
Secondly, I am so impressed by your organization. All the good... Okay, Louisa or Katya, can you translate this, please? I am so impressed by your organization. I think all the Jewish people in St. Paulo should get down on their knees and say that you folks do such a great job. Wow.
Well,
Okay.
it was a team group. Ok. Ele disse que, em primeiro lugar, gostaria de agradecer a apresentação que a Luísa fez na introdução, que fez a história do Ralph, e ele gostaria de remarcar, de considerar que, nos parabenizar pela organização daqui, pelo trabalho organizado, que foi um trabalho de equipe, né? Essa questão da Luísa traduzindo uma parte, eu traduzindo outra parte, a gente fazendo, o Roberto fazendo a formatação do slide para que ficasse melhor. Então, acho que assim, e o carinho, acho que o principal, tudo isso foi feito com muito carinho, com muita apreciação, porque essa história merecia ser apresentada assim. Ralph, I'm adding that this was done because we think that your history deserved a good wrapping. Okay, you have the content and you have the wrapping, and we have laces and flowers and do all the things, because your story inspires many people, and including us.
Inspired me.
But
and I am connected to Ralph also because my great-grandfather is from Wilkaviškis. I wish we could find something about my family, but up till now we have found nothing. I just know that because on his passport it is written that he is from Wilkaviškis.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, if nobody else is listening,
No.
this is just for Louisa. Okay, whilst I was in Warsaw, we discovered and please don't laugh, the 1818 census records of Wilkaviškis, but then nobody had surnames. But now we're working on the 1822 list of owners of cattle, pigs, and horses, and there are already surnames. So there are no Jews, obviously, that own pigs, but perhaps we may find somebody who owned horses or cattle. So don't give up yet. We're working on it.
No. Never give up.
Eles continuam, eles seguem, né? A Luísa comentou que o avô dela é da cidade e o Ralph está comentando que eles acharam um censo de 1818 e que agora, mas que trazia só nomes, sem sobrenomes. E agora estão com um censo de donos de cavalos e de gado, né? Donos de porco não está incluído. Oi?
E porcos.
E porcos. Então tá
mas que provavelmente os judeus não eram donos dos porcos, só de cavalos e gado.
Que, aliás, assim, para quem pesquisa história no Brasil, né, existem muitas fontes. Eu descobri coisas muito interessantes sobre donos de terras. Houve um censo de proprietários de terras. Os proprietários de terra foram obrigados a registrar suas terras junto à igreja. Então, existe um site muito legal, depois eu ponho aqui no comentário, para pesquisa de proprietários de terras no Brasil. Eu descobri isso lá do paterno. Uma série toda a minha família tinha as terras, de onde estava, qual era. Então, tem coisas que são, assim, muito interessantes para quem está pesquisando. A gente não foca só no nome, mas censos são documentos que ajudam muito, né? Tem duas perguntas. We have two questions here from the audience. How many people are there how many inhabitants has the city? Rubens asked.
Okay. Good evening, Ruben. In 1941, there were 7,000 people living in the city. About 3,600 were Jews, and the rest were Christians. And of the 3,600, approximately 3,000 were killed, and the others either escaped to Russia or hid. Today, there are about 14,000. In the whole area, there are about 14,000 people. So it's about as many people as you've got in a couple of apartment buildings in São Paulo.
Yeah. Another question is regarding what does Ralphie do in the kibbutz? He answered it in the beginning. If I may ask you, you prepare the best compost of Israel, okay?
In Israel.
Yeah, he takes care of the cemetery. Yeah, I know best now. Ralph. Yeah. He takes care of the cemetery and the I forgot how to say in English. Wait a minute.
Lawn. Ele corta grama. É o oficial cortador de grama. E
he cuts the grass.
E faz compostação.
And he's very busy being a grandfather and digging in Wilkaviškis.
Digging in Wilkaviškis. And you now have made, I bet, you have made a lot of friends in Germany, in Lithuania, in what else? In Poland, England.
Yeah.
I guess we have to close with the good news for our next presentation. Thank you very much Thank you.
Thank you.
Alf
Our
and
society is
Luisa.
really honored to have had you today. I said before, and I repeat, you are an inspiration for those who want to seek about their family history.
Thank you very much, Rolf. An incredible story.
Roberto, can you present the next?
Yes, we are now going into the.
You are very welcome to Brazil, Ralph, when you come here.
Thank you.
Yes, so just to close our session today, as we promised in the beginning, we will now announce our next transmission, which will happen on Sunday, September the 26th, and we will have with us an American journalist called Libby Copeland.
Então, a gente chegou na hora, como a gente tinha avisado no começo, de mostrar a nossa próxima atração, nossa próxima estrela, que vai ser em setembro, dia 26 de setembro, uma jornalista chamada Libby Copeland.
She is a freelance journalist, has written for various major newspapers in the New York area, and she has just completed the publication of a book called The Lost Family.
Ela é uma jornalista freelance que escreveu para várias publicações na região de Nova York e acabou de lançar um livro chamado The Lost Family, A Família Perdida.
In this book, she analyzes the impact of DNA testing into the history of our families.
E nesse livro ela analisa então o impacto dos testes de DNA, né, que a gente faz caseiramente, nas descobertas familiares, na família, discussão da família, da composição das famílias, né?
So this will be another very interesting conversation.
Isso, sem dúvida, vai ser uma conversação bem interessante. A gente tem várias coisas acontecendo nessa linha, como o DNA pode ajudar, né, nosso trabalho de genealogia.
So that's it for now. Please, your final words, Katia, Luisa, and maybe Rolf also.
Eu queria agradecer aos que participaram, organizando, assistindo. Eu acho que a gente está construindo. Isso é muito bom. Se você sentir que você está colaborando para a construção, para a inspiração. Eu fui inspirada quando eu fiz meus trabalhos e sigo inspirando. E acho que é uma cadeia, né? Uma engrenagem muito bacana de pessoas apoiando uns aos outros. Thank you very much.
Obrigada a todos. É bem como a Kátia falou, busca genealógica, você começa por uma curiosidade, mas depois é tudo em conjunto, porque um ajuda o outro, um incentiva o outro, um dá dica do outro, e todo mundo acaba descobrindo junto.
Muito bom. Rolf, you want to add something before we close the transmission?
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to meet you. And I admire you all very, very much indeed. Wishing you a very good day and lots of health.
Thanks to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks you very
everybody
much.
For the audience. Muito obrigado a todos aí pela audiência. E esperamos então vocês no dia 26 de setembro. Acompanhem aí pelas nossas redes. Please follow us on our social media so that you can stay with us on the next session on September the 26th. Thanks very much to all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Kisses.
Bye-bye.
Use máscara, fique em casa.